Today we're bringing us a story about Hatshepsut. Settle in. Close your eyes for a moment. Breathe, because I am about to take you somewhere extraordinary. I am about to take you back, nearly 3,500 years into the past, to a land of golden sand, of sacred rivers, of gods who walked among men, and of a woman so remarkable, so audacious, so breathtakingly brilliant that the very people who came after her tried to erase her from history entirely. They failed. This is the story of Hatshepsut, the woman who would be Pharaoh. Before we can understand Hatshepsut, we must understand the world that made her. And to understand that world, we need to go back just a little further, to a period of shame, of humiliation, of national trauma that the Egyptian people never quite forgot. Imagine, if you will, a civilization that has stood for over 1,000 years. A civilization that believes, truly, deeply in its bones believes, that it sits at the center of the universe, that its pharaohs are gods walking the earth, that its borders are protected by divine will, by the might of Ra, by the watchful eye of Horus. A civilization of pyramids and temples, of philosophers and astronomers, of artists whose work still makes modern humans weep with its beauty. Now imagine that civilization being invaded, overrun, humiliated. That is exactly what happened to Egypt around 1650 BCE, when a mysterious people from the Levant, a people the Egyptians called the Hyksos, which roughly translates to rulers of foreign lands, swept into the Nile Delta and established their own dynasty on Egyptian soil. They brought with them bronze weapons, composite bows and war chariots, technologies that the Egyptians had never seen before. And they used those technologies to do what no foreign power had ever done in recorded Egyptian history. They conquered Egypt. For roughly a century, the Hyksos ruled the northern part of Egypt from their capital at Avaris. The Egyptians were not completely subjugated. Native pharaohs continued to rule in the south, in Thebes, but the wound was deep. The humiliation was searing, and the memory of that humiliation would shape everything that came after. It was the Theban princes of the 17th Dynasty who finally said, "Enough," led by a succession of warrior kings, Senenmut, Thutmose, and ultimately Ahmose I. The Egyptians launched a decades-long campaign to drive the Hyksos out. Ahmose I, the founder of the glorious 18th Dynasty, finally succeeded around 1550 BCE. He expelled the Hyksos from Egypt, pursued them into Canaan, and established the foundation of what historians would later call the New Kingdom. The New Kingdom. Even the name sounds grand, doesn't it? Because it was. It was an Egypt reborn. An Egypt determined never to be humiliated again. An Egypt that looked outward, with new eyes. Not the comfortable, inward-looking eyes of a civilization that assumed its own supremacy, but the sharp, calculating eyes of a nation that had learned the hard way that the world beyond its borders was dangerous, and that safety required power. Military power, economic power, political power. This was the Egypt into which Hatshepsut was born. And this context matters enormously because it explains something that is often misunderstood about her. People sometimes talk about Hatshepsut as if she were an anomaly, a woman who somehow stumbled into power through a series of lucky accidents. But she was not an accident. She was a product. She was the product of a dynasty built on audacity, on the willingness to do what had never been done before, on the fierce determination to rewrite the rules. She came from a family of rule breakers. She was always going to be extraordinary. Her father was Thutmose I, and he was, by any measure, a remarkable man. He was not of royal blood, a fascinating detail that is often glossed over in popular accounts of this period. Thutmose I came to the throne through marriage, having wed Ahmose, a royal princess who carried the legitimate bloodline. This was actually a common feature of Egyptian royal succession. The divine bloodline in the Egyptian conception passed through the female line as much as the male, which meant that a man of ability could access the throne by marrying the right woman. It also means, importantly, that royal women in Egypt were never merely decorative. They were never merely the passive vessels of men's ambitions. They were the carriers of legitimacy itself. Without them there was no throne. Without them there was no divine mandate. Remember that. It will matter. Thutmose I was appointed as successor by his predecessor Amenhotep I, who died without an heir, and from the very beginning of his reign, Thutmose I announced himself as a pharaoh of extraordinary ambition. He launched military campaigns that expanded Egypt's borders further than they had ever been before. He pushed south into Nubia, modern-day Sudan, all the way to the fourth cataract of the Nile, a region of raging rapids and rocky terrain that had long marked the southern limit of Egyptian power. He then turned north, campaigning through Canaan and Syria, eventually reaching the Euphrates River. The Euphrates. Think about what that means. He marched his armies from the Nile Valley all the way to the Euphrates, a distance of over 1,000 miles, through desert, mountain and foreign territory. He erected a victory stele there, on the banks of a river that flowed, bafflingly to Egyptian minds, in the wrong direction, north to south, opposite to the sacred Nile. His soldiers reportedly stared at it in bewilderment. Their word for the Euphrates translated roughly to the water that goes upside down. He was a man who did things that had never been done before, and he had a daughter. Her name was Hatshepsut, and she was, by all the evidence we have, his favorite. We don't know exactly when Hatshepsut was born. Egyptologists have debated this for decades, and the best estimates place her birth somewhere around 1507 BCE, give or take a few years. She was born into the most powerful family in the most powerful nation on earth. She grew up in the royal palace at Thebes, a city that, in her day, was one of the most magnificent places on the planet. Thebes, the Greeks would later call it the City of 100 Gates, marveling at its scale and splendor. Its temples and monuments lined both banks of the Nile. On the east bank stood the great temple complexes of Karnak and Luxor, living temples bustling with priests and pilgrims and offerings dedicated to the king of the gods, Amun. On the west bank lay the necropolis, the city of the dead, where pharaohs were buried in elaborate tombs cut deep into the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, their bodies preserved for eternity, their spirits nourished by the prayers of the living. This was Hatshepsut's world, and she was immersed in it from the moment of her first breath. We have very little direct evidence of her childhood. Egyptian records were not interested in the early years of even the most famous individuals, but we can reconstruct it from what we know about the upbringing of royal children in the New Kingdom. She would have been educated, thoroughly, systematically educated. Royalty in Egypt, and this included royal daughters, received instruction in reading and writing hieroglyphs, in mathematics, in religious doctrine, in history, in administration. These were not ornamental subjects. These were the practical tools of power. She would have been taught by royal tutors, scribes of the highest caliber, men who served in the dual role of teacher and priest. She would have spent time in the temple precincts, learning the rituals that held the cosmos together, because in the Egyptian worldview, ritual was not merely ceremonial. It was functional. The gods required worship to continue doing their jobs. Without the daily rituals performed in the temples, the sun would not rise, the Nile would not flood, the crops would not grow. It was the pharaoh's sacred duty to maintain these rituals. And Hatshepsut, as a royal princess, would have learned them from childhood. She would have grown up surrounded by art, extraordinary, exquisite art. Egyptian art of the New Kingdom is among the finest ever produced by human hands. The painted scenes on the walls of tombs and temples are not merely decorative. They are a complete theology, a complete cosmology, rendered in pigment and stone. She would have absorbed this art the way modern children absorb television, not passively, not superficially, but as a fundamental shaping of how she understood reality. And she would have understood, very early, that she occupied a peculiar position in that reality. She was a princess. She was intelligent, remarkably, visibly, undeniably intelligent, and she was her father's daughter. There is one piece of evidence that suggests Thutmose I recognized something special in Hatshepsut very early. At some point during his reign, we don't know exactly when, he appears to have named her as his God's wife of Amun, one of the most prestigious religious titles a woman could hold in Egypt. This position gave her real ritual authority. She would have participated in the most sacred ceremonies at the temple of Amun at Karnak. She would have stood before the god himself, or rather, the god's image, and performed the sacred rites. She was not merely a princess waiting to be married off. She was, even as a girl, a figure of genuine religious and political significance. But she was still a girl. And in Egypt, as powerful as women could be, as important as they were to the divine bloodline, the throne belonged, by tradition and by almost universal expectation, to a man. How then did she become Pharaoh? Sit back. Because this is where the story gets complicated and fascinating and deeply, profoundly human. Thutmose I died around 1493 BCE. The precise circumstances of his death are unknown. He simply disappears from the records, as pharaohs tended to do, replaced by his successor. He was given a magnificent burial in the Valley of the Kings, and his successor was proclaimed. His successor was Thutmose II, and Thutmose II was Hatshepsut's husband. Let that sit for a moment, because it tends to shock modern sensibilities. Hatshepsut married her own half-brother. But let's understand the context, because without context, this is merely disturbing. Within context, it is, if not comfortable, at least comprehensible. Royal incest was a feature of many ancient dynasties, and for reasons that were both practical and theological. Practically, it kept the divine bloodline pure, or rather, kept it concentrated, undiluted by the blood of commoners or foreign dynasties. Theologically, it mirrored the divine example. The gods themselves, Osiris and Isis, Geb and Nut, had been siblings who married. If the gods did it, surely it was not merely permissible, but appropriate for their earthly representatives. Thutmose II was the son of Thutmose I by a secondary wife, a woman of lesser rank than Hatshepsut's mother. This meant that his claim to the throne, while legitimate, was strengthened enormously by his marriage to Hatshepsut, who carried the royal blood through the senior female line. He needed her. His reign needed her. Without her, his legitimacy was thinner, more fragile. And yet he became Pharaoh, not her. We know very little about Thutmose II. He is one of history's more shadowy figures, a man who existed between two much more remarkable individuals, like a quiet valley between two mountains. What we know from his mummy suggests he was not a healthy man. His body shows signs of disease, possibly a skin condition, possibly something systemic, and his reign was relatively short, probably somewhere between 3 and 13 years, with most modern Egyptologists leaning toward the shorter end of that range. He launched some military campaigns. There are records of actions in Nubia and possibly in Asia, but nothing on the scale of his father's conquests. He does not appear to have been a vigorous military leader. What was Hatshepsut's role during his reign? This is where we enter the realm of educated speculation, but the evidence suggests it was substantial. She held the title of Great Royal Wife, the chief queen, the principal consort. In Egypt, the Great Royal Wife was not merely a social companion. She was a ritual partner, She participated in the great religious ceremonies. She was depicted on temple walls alongside the pharaoh, performing sacred rites. She was, in a very real sense, the female half of the divine duality that the pharaoh embodied. She was also, by all appearances, far more capable than her husband. Did she resent her situation? Did she chafe against the constraint of being the wife when she knew she could be the ruler? We cannot know. We cannot read her inner life, but we can note that when the opportunity came, when the wheels of circumstance turned and aligned in her favor, she moved with the confidence and precision of someone who had been preparing for exactly this moment for her entire life. Hatshepsut and Thutmose II had one child together, a daughter. Her name was Neferua, and she would become important in her own right, but a daughter could not inherit the throne. Not directly, not by the conventions of the time. Thutmose II also had a son by a secondary wife, a concubine or lesser queen. This son was also named Thutmose III, and he would eventually become one of the greatest military pharaohs in Egyptian history. But at the time of his father's death, he was very young. Some estimates suggest he was only 2 or 3 years old. And then Thutmose II died. The exact year is debated. Somewhere around 1479 BCE is the most commonly cited date. He died, apparently, of his illness. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings, and Egypt was left with a toddler on the throne. This was not unprecedented in Egyptian history. Children had sat on the throne before. The solution was always the same: a regent, an adult, usually a senior official, often a royal relative, would govern on behalf of the child pharaoh until he came of age. Who was the obvious choice for regent? Hatshepsut. She was the great royal wife. She was the daughter of the previous pharaoh. She was experienced in the rituals and administration of the court. She was, by any rational measure, the most qualified person in Egypt to govern in the young king's name, and so she did. At first, for approximately 2 years, perhaps a little less, perhaps a little more, Hatshepsut served as regent for the child pharaoh Thutmose III. She governed. She administered. She performed the rituals. She sat at the center of the most powerful government on earth and did the work of pharaoh while nominally doing it in someone else's name. And then something happened. Something that has no precise parallel in all of Egyptian history. She stopped pretending. Around 1473 BCE, approximately 2 years into her regency, Hatshepsut declared herself pharaoh. Not queen, not regent, not great royal wife ruling on behalf of. Pharaoh, king of Upper and Lower Egypt, lord of the 2 lands, daughter of Ra, wearer of the double crown. Pharaoh. This was, by any measure, an extraordinary act. It had happened before in Egyptian history. There had been female pharaohs before Hatshepsut, most notably Sobekneferu of the Middle Kingdom, but not in living memory, not in the context of the 18th Dynasty's martial glory, and never quite like this. Because Hatshepsut did not claim the throne by eliminating her co-ruler. Thutmose III remained pharaoh. He remained in his position. He was not discarded, not imprisoned, not killed. What Hatshepsut did was claim the title of pharaoh alongside him. She made herself senior co-ruler, the dominant partner in what was, structurally, a dual kingship. This was genuinely unprecedented. And it raises the most obvious question. How? How did she get away with it? The answer lies in several factors, all of which she managed with extraordinary skill. First, legitimacy. Hatshepsut was, by blood, more legitimately royal than Thutmose III. She was the daughter of Thutmose I by his great royal wife. Thutmose III was the son of Thutmose I by a secondary wife. In the calculus of Egyptian royal blood, she outranked him. She didn't merely have a claim to authority. She had the strongest claim to authority of anyone in Egypt. Second, the priesthood of Amun. This is crucial and often underappreciated. By the time of the 18th Dynasty, the priests of Amun at Karnak had become enormously powerful, perhaps the single most powerful institutional force in Egypt outside the palace itself. Hatshepsut had cultivated a close relationship with Amun's priesthood throughout her life. beginning with her role as God's wife of Amun. She was their ally. She supported them. She lavished them with gifts and resources and attention. And they, in turn, supported her. To legitimize her claim, Hatshepsut did something breathtakingly clever. She commissioned a story. Literally, she had it carved into the walls of her mortuary temple at Deir el Bahri, in which the god Amun himself was her father. Not Thutmose the first. Amun. The king of the gods had, the story went, taken the form of Thutmose the first and come to her mother's bedchamber, and Hatshepsut was the divine result of that union. She was not merely a royal princess. She was the literal daughter of God. It's worth pausing here to appreciate the audacity of this move. She was not inventing the concept. Divine parentage was a standard element of royal ideology in Egypt, and most pharaohs claimed some form of divine descent. But she was weaponizing it in a very specific, very targeted way. She was saying, "My authority doesn't depend on human conventions or human bloodlines. My authority comes directly from Amun himself, and anyone who questions my right to rule is not merely questioning me. They are questioning the god." Third, competence. Perhaps the most mundane factor, and perhaps the most important. She was simply very good at the job. Under her administration, Egypt was stable, prosperous, and at peace. The machinery of government worked. The temples were maintained. The officials were paid. The Nile flooded on schedule, or rather, when it did, the government responded effectively to the flood's aftermath, distributing resources, managing agriculture. She was, by all the evidence, an excellent administrator. And in the ancient world, as in the modern one, competence generates its own legitimacy over time. Now, once she had declared herself pharaoh, Hatshepsut faced a fascinating practical problem. How do you represent a female pharaoh in a visual culture built entirely around the male body? Egyptian royal iconography was extraordinarily formalized. The pharaoh was always represented in certain ways, wearing the double crown or the Nemes headcloth, carrying the crook and flail, wearing the false beard, the ceremonial beard that was a specifically royal accessory associated with the divine and with male authority. Hatshepsut did not abandon this iconography. She adopted it. In her official images, in the statues commissioned to stand in her temples, in the reliefs carved on her monuments, Hatshepsut is represented as a male pharaoh. She wears the Nemes headcloth. She carries the crook and flail. She wears the false beard. Her body, in most official representations, is rendered with the typical male physique of a pharaoh, broad shoulders, powerful stance. But, and this is where it gets interesting, not always. In some images, particularly in certain contexts and certain periods of her reign, her female form is acknowledged. The hieroglyphic captions sometimes use feminine grammatical endings alongside the masculine royal titles, creating a kind of linguistic tension that scribes apparently worked through case by case, sometimes inconsistently. She also referred to herself in written records with a mixture of male and female pronouns, sometimes in the same inscription. Scholars have debated what this means for generations. Was she confused? Was she deliberately subversive? Was it simply the result of the titulary convention colliding awkwardly with biological reality? The most persuasive interpretation is that Hatshepsut understood the difference between the office and the person. The office of pharaoh was, by convention, male. She occupied the office. Therefore, in her official capacity, she represented herself as the office demanded. But she never denied being a woman. She simply held both things simultaneously, the female body and the male office, and let the tension between them be an acknowledgement of the genuinely unprecedented nature of what she was doing. She was, in a very modern-sounding way, performing a role while simultaneously acknowledging that the role had been written for someone else. The statues are extraordinary. Many of them survive. They were smashed and buried in antiquity, and we'll talk about that later, but enough pieces have been recovered, cleaned, and reconstructed that we can see her clearly. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York has a magnificent collection of them. They show a figure of remarkable poise and serenity, the composed, idealized face of the pharaoh rendered with the exquisite skill of the 18th Dynasty's finest sculptors. A slight smile, calm eyes, a sense of absolute, unshakable authority. She knew what she was doing. No account of Hatshepsut's reign would be complete without discussing the most important person in it, a man named Senenmut. Senenmut. Even the name sounds fascinating. He is one of the most intriguing figures of the ancient world, a man of common birth who rose to become the most powerful official in Egypt. The closest confidant of the pharaoh, the guardian of the air, the architect of some of the most beautiful buildings ever constructed by human hands. And quite possibly, much more than that. Senenmut was not born into the elite. His family was from Armant, a provincial town south of Thebes, and while his father may have been a local official of some standing, he was not of the court. He was, in the truest sense of the phrase, a self-made man. He entered royal service, possibly as a military scribe during the reign of Thutmose II, and through sheer ability, sheer intelligence, sheer relentless competence, he rose through the ranks with astonishing speed. By the time Hatshepsut became pharaoh, or possibly shortly before, Senenmut had accumulated a collection of titles that is, by any measure, staggering. He was steward of the estates of Amun. He was chief steward of the king. He was overseer of the granaries. He was overseer of the fields. He was overseer of the gardens and orchards. He was overseer of the cattle. He was overseer of the works, meaning he supervised all royal building projects. He eventually held over 80 titles simultaneously. 80 titles. To manage such a portfolio would require extraordinary organizational intelligence, a capacity to delegate, to prioritize, to see the whole while managing the parts. He was, in modern terms, effectively the Prime Minister and Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Treasury and Secretary of the Interior all rolled into one. And he appears to have done all of it brilliantly. He was also, in a deeply personal way, connected to Hatshepsut's family. He was the royal tutor. He taught Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferu, and we have exquisite statues of him holding the little princess, her small head nestled protectively within his cloak. He was clearly devoted to the child. And devotion to a pharaoh's child was, inevitably, a form of devotion to the pharaoh. But the real question, the one that has fascinated scholars and casual history lovers alike for generations, is whether the relationship between Hatshepsut and Senenmut extended beyond the professional. Whether there was a personal dimension. Whether they were, in the most straightforward terms, lovers. The evidence is tantalizing and ultimately inconclusive. The circumstantial case is strong. He was the most powerful man in Egypt. She was the most powerful woman. They worked together daily for decades. He was granted honors unprecedented for a non-royal. He was allowed to place statues of himself inside the great temple of Karnak, a privilege usually reserved for royalty. He was permitted to include his own tomb among the royal tombs on the west bank of Thebes, though he would ultimately be buried in a separate nearby tomb. These are extraordinary favors. Then there are the graffiti. On the walls of a worker's hut near Deir el Bahri, ancient Egyptians scratched informal drawings, not official art, not formal representations, but the doodles and crude jokes of ordinary people. And among these graffiti are drawings that appear to show a male figure in a sexual encounter with a female figure wearing a pharaoh's crown. Whether this represents actual gossip about Hatshepsut and Senenmut, or simply a crude joke about the general notion of a female pharaoh, is impossible to determine. But it exists. Someone in antiquity thought the association worth drawing. On the other side, the formal evidence is almost pointedly absent. Egyptian administrative records mention Hatshepsut and Senenmut constantly, but always in official contexts, always in terms of professional roles and official honors. If they were lovers, they were discreet, conspicuously discreet. The honest answer is, we don't know. We probably never will know. What we can say with confidence is that the professional partnership between Hatshepsut and Senenmut was one of the most effective and productive partnerships in the history of ancient governance. Whatever the nature of their relationship, it worked. Egypt thrived under their combined stewardship, and the monuments they built together endure to this day. Here is where Hatshepsut's story shifts from the political to the sublime, because among all her achievements, and they were many, it is what she built that perhaps most clearly reveals the quality of her mind and the depth of her ambition. She was one of the greatest builders in Egyptian history. Full stop. Not for a woman. Not given the constraints she faced. One of the greatest builders, period. In the same conversation as Ramesses the Great, as the builders of the pyramids, as the greatest monument makers of the ancient world, let's start with her masterpiece, Deir el Bahri. The mortuary temple of Hatshepsut, it stands today, has stood for 3,500 years. On the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, nestled against the dramatic limestone cliffs that form the natural backdrop of the Theban necropolis. And even today, even in a world of steel and glass and soaring modern architecture, it takes your breath away. The temple rises in 3 colonnaded terraces, each connected to the next by ramps, ascending toward the cliff face behind it in a series of horizontal lines that echo the landscape's natural geometry. It is a building that does not fight its setting, it embraces it. It becomes part of the cliff, part of the desert, part of the whole magnificent tableau of the West Bank. The Egyptians called it Djeser Djeseru, the holiest of holy places. And standing before it today, it is not hard to understand why. Every surface of Deir el Bahri was once painted. The columns, the walls, the ceilings, all of it blazing with color, reds and blues and golds and greens. The paintings told stories, the story of Hatshepsut's divine birth, the story of her great trading expedition to Punt, the story of the transport of her obelisks to Karnak. Today, most of the paint has faded, but the reliefs survive, and in their detail and sophistication, they represent some of the finest artistic work of the 18th Dynasty. The temple was not merely an architectural achievement. It was a theological statement. Everything about its design, its location, its decoration was intentional, was carefully calculated to make an argument. The argument was this person, this Pharaoh, was divinely appointed. This person's authority rested not on human convention but on divine mandate. This person was, in every way that mattered, a legitimate pharaoh. She built other things too. At Karnak, the vast temple complex on the East Bank, the spiritual heart of New Kingdom Egypt, she left her mark indelibly. She built a magnificent bark shrine, a small chapel in which the sacred bark of Amun could rest during the great processional festivals. It was made of red quartzite, carved with exquisite reliefs, and it was so beautiful that later pharaohs dismantled it and used its stones as fill material for new construction. We know this because when modern archaeologists dismantled a later pylon at Karnak, they found hundreds of her quartzite blocks inside it, perfectly preserved by their inadvertent burial. She erected obelisks. At Karnak, she commissioned 4 of them, possibly more. 2 of them still stand, the tallest ancient obelisks still in their original location. At approximately 29 meters, nearly 100 feet, they tower over the landscape of Karnak, as they have for 3.5 millennia. They were covered with electrum, a naturally occurring alloy of gold and silver, at their tips, so that when the sun struck them in the early morning, they blazed like torches of light. She recorded, on the base of one of them, her rationale for the project. She wanted them to be seen from both sides of the river, glittering in the sun, that those who looked upon them might know the power of Amun and the devotion of his daughter. This is important. She was not building for vanity alone, though vanity was certainly part of it. All pharaonic building projects had a vanity component. She was building to assert the glory of Ammon. She was building in the tradition of the great temple builders, asserting that the pharaoh's primary duty was to honor the god, and by honoring the god, she was also asserting her own credentials. Every obelisk was an argument. Every temple was a manifesto. Senenmut supervised all of this. He was her architect, her project manager, her chief engineer. He oversaw the quarrying of the granite from Aswan, hundreds of miles to the south, its transport by barge down the Nile, its shaping and erection at Karnak. He managed thousands of workers. He solved engineering problems that we can barely reconstruct today. He was, in every practical sense, the man who made her vision real. Among all the achievements of Hatshepsut's reign, one stands out for its sheer ambition, its logistical complexity, and the extraordinary detail with which it was recorded. This was the great trading expedition to the Land of Punt, and it deserves its own chapter. Punt. The Egyptians called it Ta-Necha, the land of the god. It was a fabled trading partner, known to the Egyptians since the Old Kingdom, but one that had not been visited for perhaps a generation or more by the time Hatshepsut dispatched her expedition there. Its exact location has been debated by scholars for over a century. The best current evidence, a combination of ancient texts, botanical analysis of punt-derived goods found in Egypt, and analysis of ancient baboon remains, points to the Horn of Africa, probably modern-day Eritrea, Somalia, or Djibouti. Some scholars argue for a location on the Arabian Peninsula. Wherever it was far. Reaching it required navigating the treacherous Red Sea, a body of water that, unlike the Mediterranean, was not well suited to ancient seafaring. It was full of coral reefs, its coastline was barren and inhospitable, and its winds were unpredictable. Getting there was an achievement in itself. Hatshepsut sent a fleet of 5 large ships, each approximately 70 feet long, crewed by sailors and accompanied by soldiers and trading officials. The expedition was led by a royal official, possibly Senenmut, though this is not certain. They sailed south along the Red Sea coast, reached Punt, and established contact with the local rulers. The reliefs at Deir el Bahri record what happened next in extraordinary detail. We see the Egyptian ships arriving at the coast of Punt. We see the Puntite village. Round huts, built on stilts over the water, surrounded by frankincense trees, with giraffes and cattle wandering in the background. We see the Puntite chief, whose name was Pharaoh, coming down to meet the Egyptians, and beside him, one of the most famous figures in Egyptian art, his wife, Ati. Ati was a large woman. The reliefs depict her with considerable corpulence, heavy legs, a large abdomen, an exaggerated physiognomy that Egyptians apparently found remarkable enough to depict with care. Modern medical scholars have speculated about what condition she might have had. Lipedema has been suggested, among others. Whatever it was, the Egyptian artist who carved her image did so with what appears to be genuinely observational accuracy, making her one of the most individualized and realistic figures in all of Egyptian art. The trade was conducted. The Egyptians brought weapons, food, and various manufactured goods. In return, the people of Punt offered treasures that Egypt could not obtain domestically, living myrrh trees, with their roots carefully packaged in baskets of soil for transport. An extraordinary botanical achievement, essentially the first recorded attempt at transplanting wild trees, dried myrrh and frankincense, ebony, ivory, gold, silver, eye cosmetics, animal skins, living animals, including baboons, monkeys, dogs, and even what appears to have been a giraffe. The living myrrh trees were perhaps the most audacious element of the transaction. Hatshepsut intended to transplant them in the terraced gardens of Deir el Bahri, creating, essentially, an exotic botanical garden at her mortuary temple. This was not merely decorative. Myrrh resin was used in temple rituals throughout Egypt, burned as incense, used in the mummification process, offered to the gods. By growing it domestically, she was reducing Egypt's dependence on trade for this sacred substance. Did the transplanting work? We don't know. No myrrh trees have been found at Deir el Bahri, though the soil conditions in the gardens have been analyzed and do show evidence of planting. The trees may have grown and then died, or they may never have taken root in the Egyptian climate, but the attempt was made. The ambition was real. The expedition returned to Egypt with its treasures, and Hatshepsut presented the whole achievement: the fleet, the goods, the living trees, the exotic animals, as a divine command fulfilled. She had not merely conducted a trade mission. She had, according to her own account, answered a direct request from the god Amun, who had specifically instructed her to bring him the wonders of Punt. The reliefs at Deir el Bahri record this all with a detail and a narrative sophistication that is remarkable even by the high standards of Egyptian temple art. They tell a story with characters, with a setting, with dramatic moments, with a beginning and a middle and an end. They are, in many ways, the closest thing we have to a narrative text from this period. And they were Hatshepsut's way of inscribing this great achievement permanently into the religious and cultural memory of Egypt. Throughout all of this, throughout Hatshepsut's building projects, her trading expeditions, her great religious ceremonies, Thutmose III was there, the young king, her co-ruler, the boy who should, by conventional standards, have been ruling alone. What was his experience of all this? This is one of the most tantalizing questions in Egyptology, and it is one to which we have no definitive answer. We know that Thutmose III was not marginalized in any simple sense. He was not imprisoned. He was not disinherited. He held his royal titles throughout Hatshepsut's reign. He was depicted on monuments. He led military campaigns. There are records of him conducting operations in Asia, in Nubia during this period. In fact, and this is rarely emphasized enough, during Hatshepsut's reign, Thutmose III was serving as a military commander. He was out there, in the field, learning war, and learning it well, as his subsequent career would demonstrate. The greatest military pharaoh in Egyptian history was trained during the reign of the woman he would later seek to erase from history. Did he resent her? The evidence for that comes only from after her death, when he, or someone acting in his interest, systematically destroyed her memory. But during her reign, we have no evidence of conflict, no coup attempt, no record of political opposition. The most plausible interpretation is that the arrangement, however unusual, worked. Hatshepsut ruled. Thutmose III commanded armies. The empire was maintained and even expanded. And as long as everyone was doing their job and the system was functioning, there was no particular reason for open conflict. They may have even respected each other. It is also worth noting that Neferu, Hatshepsut's daughter, appears to have been groomed as a bridge between them. There are suggestions in the evidence that Hatshepsut may have intended Neferu to marry Thutmose III, thereby continuing the dynastic line and binding the two branches of the royal family together. Whether this happened is unclear. Neferu disappears from the records around the middle of Hatshepsut's reign, probably having died young. But the intention, if it existed, speaks to a political sophistication that was always managing the future, always thinking several moves ahead. Hatshepsut is sometimes characterized as a peaceable ruler, a builder and a trader rather than a warrior. And there is truth in this. Her reign was notably peaceful compared to the reigns that preceded and followed it. She did not launch the great expansionist campaigns that Thutmose I or Thutmose III would become famous for. But peaceful does not mean passive, and it certainly does not mean militarily indifferent. There is evidence of military activity during her reign in both Nubia and in the Levant. A military official named Nessi, who also led the expedition to Punt, apparently conducted operations in Nubia. There are records of Hatshepsut's armies suppressing a rebellion in Nubia and possibly conducting some action in the region of Bigos, near the Second Cataract. There is also graffiti from the Sinai Peninsula, dated to her reign, that records Egyptian mining and military activity in that region. So she was not naive about military power. She used it when necessary. She simply chose not to make it the centerpiece of her reign in the way that some of her predecessors and successors did. And here is an argument that Egyptologists sometimes make, and that I find compelling. The peace and stability of her reign may have been exactly what Egypt needed at that moment. Thutmose I had expanded the empire enormously. Thutmose III would expand it further still. What was needed in between was consolidation, the building of infrastructure, the accumulation of resources, the strengthening of trade networks, the renovation and expansion of the temple complexes that served as the ideological backbone of Egyptian power. Hatshepsut provided all of this. She gave Egypt a generation of peace and prosperity in which to consolidate the gains of the past and prepare for the ambitions of the future. If Thutmose III was the great conqueror, Hatshepsut was the great consolidator. And without consolidators, conquerors' empires tend to fall apart. This is not a lesser achievement. It is a different one. Around 1458 BCE, approximately 20 years after she declared herself pharaoh, Hatshepsut disappears from the records, just like that. She is there, and then she is not. The royal records that had been filled with her names and her titles and her achievements simply stop recording her. Thutmose III continues. The 18th Dynasty continues. Egypt continues. But Hatshepsut, Matkare Hatshepsut, Pharaoh of Upper and Lower Egypt, daughter of Ra, the woman who had ruled the most powerful empire on earth for 2 decades, simply vanishes from the documentary record. She almost certainly died around this time. The date most frequently cited is 1458 BCE, though some scholars place it a year or two earlier or later. Her death would have been, in itself, unremarkable by the standards of the age. She was probably in her mid-40s, which, for a new kingdom Egyptian, was a respectably long life. Disease, organ failure, the accumulated burden of years, any of these could have taken her. And in 2007, something extraordinary happened that shed new light on this question. Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass, working with a team that included a mummified liver that had been found in a funerary box bearing Hatshepsut's name, along with various canopic jars and other burial equipment, used a CT scanner and DNA analysis in conjunction with an unidentified female mummy that had been lying in storage at the Cairo Museum for decades. The mummy had been found in a tomb in the Valley of the Kings designated KV60, which also contained the mummy of a woman identified by inscription as Sit-R, likely one of Hatshepsut's royal nurses. The analysis of the unidentified mummy found in that tomb, an obese woman with a missing tooth, produced a startling result. The missing tooth matched a tooth found in the funerary box bearing Hatshepsut's name exactly. The CT analysis suggested the woman had died of bone cancer, possibly secondary to diabetes. She was middle-aged at death. Was this Hatshepsut? Hawass and his team believed so, and announced it to considerable fanfare. The discovery made headlines worldwide. But the Egyptological community has been more cautious. The DNA evidence was inconclusive by the standards required for certain identification, and other experts have raised questions about the methodology and interpretation. What this likely means is Hatshepsut's mummy may have been found, and she may have died of cancer. But we cannot say this with certainty. The mystery of her precise end, the exact circumstances of her death, the location of her burial, the fate of her remains at least partially unsolved. What we can say is this: she died. And then something happened that she could not have anticipated, could not have prevented, and could not have known about. Her memory was attacked. Sometime after Hatshepsut's death, and probably not immediately after, but years later, deep into Thutmose III's subsequent sole reign, a systematic campaign was conducted against her memory. Her images were smashed. Her name was chiseled out of inscriptions. Her statues were dragged from the temples and broken and buried. The obelisks at Karnak, those magnificent towering monuments she had erected, were not destroyed. They were too large, too firmly planted for that, but were walled in, enclosed within a masonry casing that hid them from view. Wherever her name appeared, on walls, on columns, on the faces of statues, on the surfaces of obelisks, her name was removed. In its place, sometimes, was substituted the name of her father, Thutmose the first, or her husband Thutmose the second, or Thutmose the third himself. In other places, the space was simply left blank. For a long time, for most of the period of modern Egyptology, in fact, it was assumed that this erasure had been conducted by Thutmose III out of personal resentment, out of bitterness at having been subordinated to a woman for 20 years, out of wounded masculine pride. It's a compelling narrative. It's emotionally satisfying. It makes a clean, dramatic story. The stepson takes his revenge on the usurping stepmother. But it's almost certainly wrong. Here's why. If Thutmose III had hated Hatshepsut, if he had been burning with resentment throughout her reign, waiting for her death to take his revenge, why did he wait? The erasure did not begin immediately after her death. Based on the best current scholarly analysis, the campaign against her memory began approximately 20 years after she died, when Thutmose III was himself an old man, at the end of a long and spectacularly successful reign. Why would an old man, at the peak of his achievements, suddenly turn his attention to erasing the memory of a woman who had been dead for 2 decades? The most persuasive current theory is that the erasure had nothing to do with personal resentment and everything to do with dynastic succession. Thutmose III, late in his life, was concerned about the transition of power to his son, Amenhotep II. He wanted to ensure that the succession was clean, unambiguous, uncontested, and Hatshepsut's monuments, still standing, still prominently featuring a female pharaoh, complicated the story. They raised the possibility that a woman could rule, that the male monopoly on pharaonic power was not absolute, and that possibility, in the context of a succession that Thutmose III wanted to be smooth and uncomplicated, was dangerous. By erasing Hatshepsut from the official record, he was not taking revenge on a dead woman. He was tidying up history. He was making the story of Egyptian kingship simpler, cleaner, and more unambiguous for his successors. He was eliminating a precedent. This interpretation is supported by the fact that the erasure was selective and practical, rather than thorough and vindictive. Her most visible monuments, the ones that the public would regularly see, and that would require enormous effort to destroy, were treated carefully. The obelisks were hidden rather than demolished. The reliefs in the most accessible parts of her temples were targeted first. The remote or inaccessible ones were often left alone. This was not the work of a man consumed by fury. It was the work of an administrator managing a narrative. And here is the final irony, the one that Thutmose III could never have foreseen. The erasure failed. Not immediately. For most of the subsequent 3,000 years, Hatshepsut was lost to history, her name unknown, her achievements uncredited. But when Jean-François Champollion cracked the hieroglyphic code in the 1820s, and Egyptologists began the painstaking work of reading the ancient texts, they started to notice something. Blank spaces, chiseled out names, buried statues, the traces of a deliberate erasure, the shadow of an absence, and they asked, who was this, who was so thoroughly removed, who was so threatening that everything bearing their image had to be destroyed? The answer, when it came, was extraordinary. The modern rediscovery of Hatshepsut is a story of detective work spanning nearly 2 centuries, involving dozens of scholars on multiple continents, countless hours in museum basements and desert excavations, and one of the most satisfying intellectual puzzles in the history of archaeology. It began, in a sense, with Champollion himself. When he visited the temple at Deir el Bahri in 1828, the first time he had seen it in person, after years of studying it through drawings and records, he noticed something odd. The temple was clearly associated with a pharaoh. The cartouches, the oval rings enclosing royal names, were everywhere, but the cartouches showed a female name, Matkare, and the gender of the inscriptions was inconsistent. Sometimes masculine, sometimes feminine, sometimes both in the same text. He was puzzled but did not have the time or resources to pursue it further. He died in 1832, before the mystery could be resolved. It was the British Egyptologist John Gardner Wilkinson who first, in 1828, noted the anomalous female pharaoh at Deir el Bahri. It was his compatriot, James Burton, who began to untangle the inscriptions. But it was the German Egyptologist Carl Richard Lepsius, working in the 1840s, who began to build a more systematic picture of who this mysterious ruler might have been. The real breakthrough came in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, when the great archaeologist Edouard Neville conducted the first systematic excavation of Deir el Bahri for the Egypt Exploration Fund, beginning in 1893. Neville's work produced the first comprehensive published record of the temple's inscriptions and reliefs. It was now possible to read the story, or at least the official story that Hatshepsut had caused to be inscribed on her temple walls, in full detail for the first time in millennia. And then, in 1903, an American Egyptologist named Herbert Winlock, working for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, made a discovery that would ultimately change everything. In a pit near the temple of Deir el Bahri, he found fragments. Thousands and thousands of fragments of broken statues, smashed, presumably deliberately, and thrown into a deep pit where they had lain, undisturbed for 3,500 years. He recognized immediately that these were extraordinary pieces. The workmanship was superb, clearly royal, clearly of the highest caliber, but they were all broken. Systematically, deliberately broken. He and his team spent years collecting and cataloguing the fragments. They were eventually transported to the Metropolitan Museum, where the work of reconstruction began. It is one of the great achievements of modern archaeological conservation. Piece by piece, over decades, the shattered statues of Hatshepsut were reassembled. Not all of them. Thousands of fragments remain unmatched, but enough to see her face. Enough to understand what the statues had looked like, what they had represented, how they had been arranged in the terraced gardens of her temple. Enough to see, clearly, the extraordinary quality of the art that had been commissioned in her name. The Metropolitan Museum today houses one of the finest collections of Hatshepsut statuary in the world. When you walk through those galleries, through the rows of kneeling figures, the serene faces, the crook and flail, the false beards, you are walking through what was once a field of rubble. You are seeing reassembled beauty. You are seeing history rescued from deliberate oblivion. Let's step back now and talk about why this story matters, because it is more than just a fascinating episode from the ancient world. It speaks to something deeply human, deeply universal, and deeply relevant. Hatshepsut ruled for approximately 20 years. Under her stewardship, Egypt was prosperous and stable. She built monuments that have endured 3.5 millennia. She conducted trade expeditions that brought Egypt into contact with distant lands and enriched her people materially and culturally. She commissioned art of transcendent quality. She administered a complex empire with apparent skill and competence. She mentored, or at least employed, one of the most talented bureaucrats of the ancient world. And then she was erased, not immediately, not out of obvious hatred, but erased nonetheless, carefully and systematically, because her existence was inconvenient to a narrative that those who came after her preferred. She was not erased because she had failed. She was erased because she had succeeded. She was erased because the precedent she represented, that a woman could rule, that the highest office could be occupied by someone who did not conform to the expected template, was dangerous to those who preferred the template to remain intact. Does that sound familiar? I am not suggesting a simple equivalence between ancient Egyptian politics and modern gender politics. That would be anachronistic and reductive. But it would be dishonest to pretend that Hatshepsut's story does not resonate with things we recognize. the pattern of extraordinary women being erased from history, their achievements unrecorded, uncredited, attributed to others, or simply denied, is not unique to ancient Egypt. It is one of the consistent patterns of recorded human history, and Hatshepsut is one of its most dramatic examples. But here is what I want to leave you with. Here is the thing that I find most extraordinary about this whole story. She lost the battle for the historical record. She was erased. Her name was chiseled out. Her statues were smashed. For most of the last 3,000 years she was unknown. And yet, she won. Because what Thutmose III could not smash, could not chisel out, could not bury in a pit, was the quality of her work. The temple at Deir el Bahri could be damaged, its inscriptions could be altered, but it could not be made to disappear. The obelisks at Karnak could be walled in, but the walls eventually fell, and there the obelisks still stand, still blazing in the Egyptian sun, still readable if you know how to read them. The fragments of her statues could be scattered, but they could not be made into nothing. The stone retained its form, its beauty, its testimony to what had been done and by whom. And so when the modern world came along, with its new tools, its new methods, its extraordinary capacity for detective work and reconstruction, it found her. Not despite the erasure, but partly because of it. The very act of erasing her created traces, blank spaces where names should have been, chiseled cartouches that left shadows in the stone, statues buried so carefully that they survived better than they might have if they had simply been left standing. She is one of the best documented female rulers of the ancient world. Her temple is one of the most studied buildings in Egypt. Her statues fill museum galleries on 3 continents. Her story is taught in universities, written about in scholarly journals, dramatized in novels and documentaries and podcasts. She is 3,500 years after her death, more famous than she has ever been. Thutmose III tried to erase her. He failed. What happened to the people around her? Thutmose III, freed from the constraints of sharing power, went on to have one of the most spectacular reigns in Egyptian history. He launched 17 military campaigns in 20 years. He expanded Egypt's empire to its greatest ever territorial extent, from the Euphrates in the north to the Fourth Cataract in the south. He won the Battle of Megiddo, one of the earliest battles described in detail in ancient records, where he outmaneuvered a coalition of Canaanite city-states with tactical brilliance. He is sometimes called the Napoleon of ancient Egypt, a comparison that flatters Napoleon more than Thutmose III. He ruled alone for 30 years after Hatshepsut's death, and is widely considered one of the greatest pharaohs of all time. It is an interesting historical irony that the man who tried to erase Hatshepsut is himself, in modern popular culture, often described primarily in relation to her. Senenmut's fate is unknown. He disappears from the records before Hatshepsut's death, or at least, the records of his activities become sparse and then absent toward the end of her reign. There are suggestions that his tomb was vandalized. The face on his tomb painting was scratched out, a form of personal damnatio memoria that suggests enemies had been made. Whether he fell from favor, died, or simply retired into obscurity, we cannot say. His tomb exists. It was excavated in the early 20th century and contains remarkable astronomical paintings on the ceiling, the earliest complete astronomical ceiling known from ancient Egypt, showing constellations and decans that are of great importance to our understanding of Egyptian astronomy. Neferua, Hatshepsut's daughter, appears to have died young. She vanishes from the records around year 11 or 12 of Hatshepsut's reign, when she would have been in her mid to late teens. She never married Thutmose III, as far as we know. She never ruled. She is a poignant figure, privileged beyond measure, deeply loved by her mother and by Senenmut, who tutored her, and then simply gone, consumed by whatever illness or accident took so many ancient people before their time. The temple at Deir el Bahri stood, was used, fell into disuse, was partly destroyed, was partly repurposed by later peoples, and was eventually buried under sand and rubble. It was excavated, studied, debated, restored, and is today one of the most visited archaeological sites in Egypt, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, a destination for scholars and tourists and pilgrims from around the world. Every year, hundreds of thousands of people stand before it and look up at its colonnaded terraces and feel something. An awe that crosses 3,500 years. A recognition that whoever built this, whoever dreamed this, and commanded this and inscribed this, was extraordinary. That was Hatshepsut. And so we come to the end. 3,500 years ago, a woman was born into extraordinary privilege in the most extraordinary civilization on earth. She was smart, she was determined, she was politically gifted, she was aesthetically refined. She found herself in a position that no convention prepared for, a royal woman with the ability to rule but not the title. And she did something unprecedented. She claimed the title. And she ruled for 20 years. She built temples that still stand. She sent ships to distant shores. She filled her kingdom with art and beauty and the glory of the gods she served. She governed with apparent competence and apparent wisdom, and the people of Egypt, under her rule, appear to have prospered. And then she died, and then, years later, the traces of her existence were systematically removed. Her name was chiseled from stone. Her face was smashed. The world was made to forget her. And then the world remembered. The hieroglyphs were cracked open. The stone spoke. The buried statues were found and reassembled. The blank spaces in the inscriptions were read, not for what was there, but for what was so pointedly absent. And slowly, painstakingly, across the work of generations of scholars and archaeologists and conservators, Hatshepsut was restored. She sits today in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in a score of statues, serene and composed, wearing the false beard, holding the crook and flail, gazing with those calm, knowing eyes into a world that tried and failed to forget her. She sits in the Cairo Museum, in her fragment, her tooth matching its box. She stands in her obelisks, still at Karnak, still 97 feet tall, still legible, still reading to anyone who looks, "I am Hatshepsut, I was here, remember me." And on the west bank of the Nile, where the cliffs rise in their magnificent limestone theatre, where the sun sets every evening behind the peak that the Egyptians considered the home of the goddess Meretzige, she who loves silence, the temple stands, Jeseru, the holiest of holy places. 3,500 years, earthquakes, floods, invasions, the rise and fall of empires, the transformation of religion, the replacement of hieroglyphs by alphabet, papyrus by paper, scroll by book by screen, all of this, and the temple stands. That is her answer to the erasure. That is what she built. That is who she was. She was Hatshepsut. She was Pharaoh. She was one of the greatest rulers in the history of the world. And she was not forgotten. As we come to the end of this story, remember, history doesn't whisper, it roars. And as long as you keep coming back, we'll make sure its voice is never silenced. Thank you for being here today, fellow historian. The past has more to tell us, and we'll be back to listen. Until then, stay curious, stay hungry for knowledge, and remember, history chose us to remember it. See you on the next one.